Hi, I'm Susan and welcome to the third episode of Stitched Stories, where we take a look at the material culture around our little girl Mary in 1840 in St. Louis, where she's learning to make her first doll quilt. And I'm so glad you're joining me. I'm excited about the progress people are making, and I love seeing what you're doing. Thank you for posting it on First Stitches on Instagram for everyone to view. You're welcome here, whether you're stitching, knitting, quilting, whatever you're up to. Please join me as we talk about the life and times in 1840. Now, in episode 2, which was the last episode, we looked at education in 1840 and how children were taught and how Mary and her contemporaries likely learned, and especially how they learned to sew. I think that episode is fascinating. I hope you had a chance to watch it. Today we're going to look at the occupation of sewing, how sewing and things that are not normally discussed, as far as employment of women and what it meant to be a seamstress or a mantua-maker, which we'll discuss a little more, and their relationship to tailors. Now, as you know, I have all my sewing set up, but I typically don't get a ton done. I hope you do. I won't ask you to look up too often. I just want you to listen and enjoy. But I have my sewing here, and this is not a tutorial. This is actually just me stitching along with you. If you want specific instruction on how to construct this project, if you purchase the kit, or if you're joining me with your own supplies, please look at the tutorials. I do have all of this information linked in a playlist on my YouTube channel for you, so you can easily access everything you need. And I have my notes here, so we're ready to go. Now, if you did purchase the kit, you'll remember that the fabrics I curated in the kit that I put together are reproduced from fabrics that were available in 1840, most likely. Now this means in a scrap bag, you might have fabrics from 1830 that were placed in the scrap bag, because it's not unusual to have fabrics from many years before the actual time you're stitching in your scrap bag. I've got fabrics in my own collection that I've had for almost 40 years, if you can believe that. So anyway, so the fabrics in here were fabrics that would have likely have been available in 1840, and that's not to say that after 1840 these still weren't available. But I chose these as representations of what Mary may have had access to. And you know, as I've crafted this story, Mary is a 6-year-old little girl living in St. Dress. She's an immigrant. Her family immigrated from England, and her mother is a seamstress and a dressmaker, because there's a difference, we're going to find out. And her grandmother, who lives with her as well, is a hat maker or a milliner, and her father is a tinsmith. And we will talk more about tinsmithing, because I have some great questions people have asked about that, and I definitely want to get to it. So let me tell you a little bit about why I chose these fabrics. And I have talked about the fabrics of 1840 in a previous floss tube that I will link below if you're interested. But one of the most popular colors during that time was brown. And if you purchase the kit, you'll know that there are a lot of shades of brown in your kit. And here's a few of the fabrics that you might have. And you might say, well, gosh, Susan, brown's just kind of drab, and it's not my favorite color. You know, brown in this situation, especially for this project, is more of a backdrop. It's more of the background fabric to showcase the other colors. And you can see that these, you know, and modern reproduction mills and manufacturers are doing a pretty good job of reproducing the fabrics as they were in 1840. But you can see they range from really dark chocolatey browns to kind of lighter tans to this one that almost has a hint of purple. And if you've studied fabric from that time, you know that as browns from that time faded, they did end up looking purple. But in spite of that, brown was one of the most stable dyes in 1840, and so it was available everywhere because it was easy to reproduce. And I have to think, with dusty, unpaved roads, it hid the dirt along dress skirts, and maybe that was another reason for it. I don't know that for a fact. So brown was definitely a key color. Now, another color that was available and popular during that time was pink. And the pink was actually what is referred to as something called a double pink. So it had 2 or 3 shades of pink or red, and these required a mordant, and the design elements were either hand painted or applied using an acid resist. Now that's a lot of technical information on how they were printed, but pink was also in fashion. So, we want Mary to have the highest fashion fabrics in her doll quilt. And remember, as a dressmaker, her mother being a seamstress or a dressmaker, she would have had cast-offs from that and that she could use. Another color that you saw during this time, and I love, and it's hard to find, a lot of manufacturers aren't reproducing this color these days, is Prussian blue. It's just a vibrant, gorgeous blue. It's been difficult to reproduce accurately, but it was also in fashion, and it originated from the dye compound used to outfit the Prussian army, and that's why it was given the name Prussian blue. And you can see even in this little background fabric, there's some Prussian blue elements. And then, of course, how could we make a doll quilt from this time period without the color red? And so red was also several shades available, from bright turkey red to kind of these softer, more muted, deeper shades. And this red was mainly dyed with madder, which is a plant, and it was available. And some of these red fabrics were extensively complicated to reproduce. Oh, here's another beautiful Prussian blue. I don't know. Now, every kit is slightly different, so you may not have all these fabrics. You may or may not have them, but you certainly should have something close if you don't have this exact Prussian blue. So those are some of the colors in your kit, and you might also have some indigo as well, which was kind of a color that was available across the 1800s. Another one of my favorites. So those are colors, but let's talk about styles too. There are also prints on these colors that were very, fashionable and available, and let's take a look at that. So one of the styles that is, probably one of my favorites is a chintz. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about chintz. I have done a special episode where I talked about it in length and in depth, and you can find that on my YouTube channel. I'll link it below. But chintz was a fabric that had a long history, and it came to Europe in the 17th century from the East, and eventually it made its way to America, of course. And it's a large-scale floral. It was either hand-drawn or block printed, and it was very popular in home decor, and it wasn't actually considered high class, and some of the more financially challenged folks would take the cast-offs of European or European home interior draperies and upholstery and refashion them into dresses. So it was not considered classy. I think it's gorgeous and I love it, but it was block printed and used, like I said, for interior decorating, and then it became a fashionable loungewear and more comfort wear. And of course now I think it's I think it's gorgeous. Another word that we hear a lot when we're talking about fabric is the word calico. It's often interchanged with the word chintz, and it's kind of a different definition regionally and so on. I think in Europe it's just a plain muslin cloth would be considered a calico. But as far as I'm concerned, when I'm talking about it, it would refer to kind of a smaller scale print, something with just a floral design that kind of is either tossed or foulered, which is, you know, in a horizontal diagonal repeat. And so those were very popular and available. Plaids were also kind of a rage, and you see a lot of dresses from that time period in plaid. And then stripes. Stripes were something that was worn across the century, and there's been many meanings associated with stripes, not always good. And I do have another special edition video where I talked about that in more depth. It's just kind of a fun discussion if you like a little deeper study into these prints. But so those are some of the things that are available in your kit for your use. And if you're not using the kit, you might want to throw some of those in if that is at all interesting and meaningful to you. All of these prints would have graced Mary's mother's cutting table as a dressmaker, and the scraps would have been kept for patches in repairs that she was making, alterations to people's clothing that she was doing, padding if she was puffing up a sleeve or adding some kind of a decorative padded element to an outfit. These scraps would have been available. They were claimed by tailors and dressmakers alike, and some tailors and dressmakers were actually accused of exaggerating the amount needed for a dress so they could keep these scraps. They could benefit from the exorbitant scraps, so you really needed to have an ethical tailor or dressmaker. This excess fabric also has a funny history as well. It was sometimes referred to as the cabbage, or what was taken or purloined by tailors and their employees. You know, the dress fabric was the responsibility of the customer to access. And if the dressmaker had fabric that was sold in their shop, of course they could purchase it there. But there were other places that fabric could be purchased, and that fabric then could be brought to the dressmaker or tailor, or seamstress. So anyway, it's interesting that these scraps. So we're going to just believe that Mary's mother was a very ethical seamstress, and she only used the cast-off remnants that were from small, you know, leftover cuts from a sleeve or another part of the item that she was reproducing or making. So we've discussed some of the tools in your kit as well, and remember I've told you that during this time there was no standard seam allowance. There was no, now we're very conscious of a 1/4 inch seam or a 1/2 inch seam and things like that. There just wasn't a standard for that. And if you watched episode 2 of Stitch Stories, you know that this little Bristol paper was used with your fabric, and some of you are actually doing this, and I'm so pleased that you're trying it. And it was placed on the fabric by the children as they learned to crease a seam and stitch it. And you know, they could have placed it quite close to the edge. They wouldn't have been able to press any fabric over very well. But they, might not have been a 1/4 inch. It might have been a 3/8 of an inch seam. It could vary. As long as the line was creased and consistent around the square, you would get that same amount of fabric left over for your patch. So things were different, and we have measuring tools. I'm sure if you are a stitcher or a quilter, you have a few rulers, probably more than one. I'm guilty of having a whole lot in my sewing room, but and paper. So during this time as well, paper patterns were not available. Pins were precious. Now, paper patterns were not available, and the garment itself was used. An older garment was used to fashion the next garment, and used as the template or paper pattern for the next outfit. And patterns were available in a few books and may have been in St. Louis at this time. Likely her mother, if she had been a seamstress or dressmaker in England before she came, she would have brought any pattern books with her to have. The pictures are so tiny, and you'd had to draft from this teeny tiny picture the dimensions to fit the person's body. So patterns were challenging, and it was not easy. Pins at this time were precious, and as you know, if you purchased the kit, your pins came in pin papers. That's how they were sold, and you would place them in your pin cushion, and then they would go back into the papers. You didn't want to lose your pins. Pins were hand wrought, and if you didn't have access to pins, you couldn't run down to the store and buy more. You might have to mail away from them. If your local shop like St. Louis probably had some fairly good general stores that had merchandise. Well, if they ran out of pins and you ran out of pins, you were out of luck. So you saved every pin that you had and reused it. Now, as far as measurements go, there was a semi-standard, and that was an allotment that was referred to as nails. And nails meant approximately 2 1/4 inches. But it wasn't precise and it wasn't exact. And it was basically just marked off on a piece of paper, this length. And so you would ask for the nails. Measurement was done by tailors with papers. And so each person would have, if you were a client of a dressmaker or tailor, you would have been assigned a paper. Your name would be on it, and hatch marks would be made. This is the hatch mark that represents my wrist size. And so the tailor or dressmaker would have this in their supply, and if you came in for a fitting, they would probably check, your neck, your wrist, your arm length, and all of these measurements would be kept on this paper. And if your waist changed size, that would be readjusted on your tailor's paper. I find that fascinating as well. They were used to take the needed measurements for your garment and then kept, of course, as a reference for future clothing items. Your Bristol ruler that's in your kit is made to kind of represent that. This is a firmer paper, and it's used for a nice straight edge, and also this, marking off increments. And increments, as you will see later, are kind of subjective and will be, kind of based on as needed. So another tool of the trade is a tailor's shear or a dressmaking shear. And they're meant to be used in a way that we're probably not accustomed to. So I'm going to insert a little video here about how dressmaking shears were originally designed to be used. So I want to show you how dressmaking shears were designed to be used. They're, if you've held traditional dressmaking shears, they're usually kind of heavy. And the reason for that is the weight of the shear is used as you cut in a forward motion, and that that weight holds the fabric and helps you propel forward with your cutting. And this edge is meant to drag along the table as you go. So you would have a dressmaking pin cushion or something heavy to hold the fabric down as you were cutting. And as you were cutting, this back handle would be dragging along the table. And you can try this sometime at home on a length of fabric. You'll be amazed at how dragging it along the table propels you and gives you a little more control to your cutting. So you can see that the weight of the scissors, because today we opt for lightweight scissors because we tend to hold them up and cut without using the drag and the weight of the scissor all across the table. So yeah, interesting. And like I said, patterns for clothes were constructed from an existing garment. Now there is a book written by a woman named Claudia Kidwell, and she writes that a bit about the exploration of pattern making. And during that time, paper in large sheets, like we're used to when we get a pattern from Joann's or wherever, we have that lovely tissue paper pattern that we cut from and adjust to our size. That kind of paper wasn't available. And so, like I said, the dressmaker would use a person's existing clothing item to fashion the next clothing item from. Then that old clothing item might have been cut down or reused for a child's outfit. So it's just really interesting. Patterns did become available in around 1870, but we're talking 1840, and it just wasn't happening. I better get some stitches in. I hope you're getting some stitches in. I get excited about this because I find it fascinating. I'm very fascinated by the way people did things in previous times, and with limited tools that we are so accustomed to, they were able to get so much done. So, how was it that this occupation of dressmaking developed? Was it always around? Wasn't it just male tailors that sewed clothing? There's a lot of information that we don't know because women's history wasn't always written. But any one of you who have attempted clothing construction, or even just started this project for the first time, you have to have a huge appreciation for the skill that was required and the understanding of fabric and the dexterity and just the whole mathematical, geometric analysis of clothing construction. And typically in the 1800s, the fabric for the clothing item itself was actually worth more than the dressmaker would be paid. It's amazing. So no wonder they wanted to keep the scraps. That was kind of a tip or a little added benefit to all the hard work they've been doing. If you're watching this and you haven't started your project, I hope that this makes your project more meaningful to you. And if you're just listening and you're not working on the project, I hope it gives you a deeper appreciation. I do find myself kind of pondering lives of people who've gone before and what things would have been like. So to really understand the history of dressmaking, we have to take a look back to the end of the 17th century, when women, or mantua-makers as they were called, began to infiltrate the male-dominated business of tailor. And there's really been little studied about this, like I said, and much can be learned from the diaries and the letters. There were apprenticeship records and account books. There are inventories and census returns from women who did venture into this line of work. And that's really all we have to pull from to learn about it. But early mantua makers, their challenge was not great. They were making very boxy, large, flowing outfits, and they weren't detailed and fitted. So their work was a little easier initially. But in the 19th century, style and fashion had changed, and dressmaking and millinery businesses were being established in record numbers. There had kind of been an assumption up until that time that these businesses and all needlework endeavors were demeaning for women. There is a little bit of that feeling that permeates some of the literature out there. And, I think that's a little bit of an oversimplification. I think needlework also was a very freeing thing for women, as they were able to establish their own business and make an income, earn a living. There are so many trades that involved the use of sewing and the needle for men and women alike. And I will talk more about men and their tools, but this is mostly centered on Mary and her mother and her grandmother. But there definitely were a range of occupations, and there is a hierarchy in these occupations. They're not all as respected as others. So milliners and dressmakers are definitely at the top of the list. The skills that they needed to produce their items was, they had to have some skills. And they were kind of respected in the pecking order of sewing society, if you will. They were kind of looked upon as being as important as the establishment that they were employed by. And so, if the establishment was high end, they were thought of as high end. And many of these dressmaking establishments and millinery establishments were provided both services. And a lot of milliners also knew dressmaking construction, and vice versa. Some of these establishments, like I said earlier, sold fabric, and also the fabric was the responsibility of the customer. So if someone had been overseas, taken a journey to the eastern seaboard of the United States at that time, and gone to a fabric store, purchased yardage for a dress, they could bring it back then to their home and have their local dressmaker put it together. So milliner and dressmaker were at the top of the pile. And then next in the order, and also I should say that the smaller the town, the more overlap in skill that these people needed to have. Obviously, you kind of had to be a jack of all trades if you were in a small town. So next in order of importance, as far as the hierarchy of sewing or fabric-related occupations, was a draper. And a draper was a wholesale person, sold wholesaler of cloth, mainly for clothing. And then there was a haberdashery, which I know you've heard about because that term has been used modern day with a different meaning. But a haberdashery in the 1800s was a business who sold small articles for sewing, dressmaking, and knitting. So it would have been like a notions or a knickknacks, sewing knickknacks store, which I could have loved going there. I love those today. I love sewing notions. And then there was a mercer. And a mercer was a merchant or trader who dealt in fine cloth that was not produced locally. Now, a mercer would be, all that absolutely gorgeous fabric from Europe would have been sold through the mercer. And perhaps in St. Louis, Mary's mother was able to access that. She was from the UK and or England at that time, and she probably had friends, so she might have had that available for people who were interested. Now, like I said, mentioned earlier, the skills of the early mantua makers didn't need to be high. The clothing was loose fitted, and it just really didn't require a whole lot of tailoring or fitting. But later, as styles changed and inexpensive cotton prints became widely available, cutting and fitting skills were required for dressmakers. And you really needed knowledge, and you needed to know what you were doing. And the knowledge required for dressmaking was the same knowledge as tailors used. And women were not allowed into tailors' guilds. So they couldn't be an apprentice to a tailor. So how did women learn these skills? They would have only had access to that information secondhand. It's a bit of a mystery how they learned, but clearly they did, because they either figured it out on their own, overheard their male tailor counterparts at work. It's up to our imagination, really, because as far as the information that I've read in these sources, we don't really know how they learned. Now, there was a lot of opposition from the tailors when women started to infiltrate this market. And in the early 1700s, you could start a business as a dressmaker or a mantua-maker with very little required. You needed your thimble, which I haven't been using. You needed your thread, and of course, here's my thread papers. You needed needles, and you needed pins, and you needed a cutting table. And this is actually a cutting table from the 40s, this little wood table that I'm working on. And so you really didn't need a whole lot. That was it. And you could, and of course your knowledge and your skill, and you could get started in business. Perhaps this is why Mary's mother and grandmother were able to establish a line of work in the 1840s in St. Louis, as I've crafted in this story. But by the early 1800s, mantua makers were established, and they were actually able to take on apprentices. So women were then apprenticing other women, and many of them were poor, who would work for very low wages, and that's where some of the feelings of inequity come in. But they were typically at the low end of the earning spectrum, and so these mantua makers or seamstresses would hire people and train them on up. And some of these trained workers went to establishments, and they learned to construct clothing, and they could actually, at some point, construct an outfit that someone could buy off the rack and then have adjusted to their sizes. So that concept of going into a store and having something ready-made was already starting in this time. Everything didn't have to be made from the ground up, which I find amazing. You know, today that's all we really have, unless you go to a really high-end or establishment, or you want to make your own custom outfit. So these early off-the-rack dresses required minimal alteration. And in 1840 in St. Louis, a shop that offered dressmaking and millinery products would have been highly sought after, and it would have been a very busy establishment. And so Mary's mother and grandmother would have been very busy. As always, I've done lots of talking. I hope you've done lots of stitching on whatever you're working on today, and you've been listening, and I hope you find this interesting. If you would like to dive into a little further study, I have a few things to recommend to you. This book I've recommended before. It's Small Endearments by Sandy Fox. The intro to this talks a little bit about early sewing and early occupations in sewing, and it gives you a lot of information on doll quilts and things over the centuries. Another book that I found so fascinating is Busks, Basques, and Brush-Braid by Pam Inder, and I did mention that earlier on today. Definitely, if you find this interesting and you want to know a little more about early dressmaking, check this one out. There is a blog where you can learn a lot about fabric across the century, and that is the blog by Barbara Brackman. She has several different lines of thought, and you can check out any of those. She has several blogs, actually, several titles. They're all great. Fantastic, actually. There is an Instagram account that Penny Tucker made me aware of called Dressing Period History, and I will link all of this information below. And she reenacts and makes clothing, time period clothing, and has done a lot with 1840s fashion. You might find that fascinating as well. And then there are books by Claudia Kidwell, and they also discuss some of these things. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed, and I hope you've made some progress, and I'll see you next time. Remember, if you want specifics on how to put your doll quilt together, please hop over to the tutorials. And if you want to hear more about me and my stitching and what I'm up to, check out my YouTube my floss tube regular episodes to get a little more information about that. So thank you for joining me today, and until we see you again, make time for stitching. Bye, friends.